In a world where silence is often regarded as a protective shield, the death of Menglong poses an unavoidable paradox. When a life that was once vividly present before the public suddenly vanishes, the terror lies not only in the loss itself, but in the information void that persists afterward. Is it possible that, in the complex power chessboard of the entertainment industry, silence is no longer neutral, but has become a deliberate move, and the aura that once surrounded a human being, was it true glory, or merely a layer of light covering a grave built of pressure, contracts, and late-coming empathy? 100 days have passed since Menglong departed from this world. Measured against the scale of history, 100 days is a brief, almost insignificant duration. However, for those still trying to understand what happened, those 100 days carry the weight of waiting, of inquiry, and of an unsoothed sense of unease. Death in itself is an inevitable part of human life. What prevents the public from finding peace is the fact that this departure is shrouded in a faint mist, where fundamental questions have yet to find a satisfactory explanation. There are those who admit that, before this story unfolded, they were accustomed to a state of indifference. Life proceeded with its familiar rhythm, and the seemingly distant issues of celebrities rarely touched personal emotions. However, the incident involving Menglong created a silent shockwave. It forced many to stop, to open their eyes, and to look into the dark corners that have always existed, but are often ignored. When a story remains unclarified, silence is no longer a harmless choice. It gradually becomes a psychological burden spreading through society. Across the digital space, a symbolic image has been circulated in recent days, countless small hands together supporting and pushing a creature forward. Some once remarked sarcastically that even if hundreds of millions of small individuals united, they would not have enough strength to create any significant change. Yet that very image poses another, deeper question. Is the value of an individual measured by solitary strength, or by the ability to raise a voice together when facing injustice and information voids? The concern for Menglong, therefore, is not merely a momentary curiosity about a celebrity. It reflects a deeper need, the need to understand, to know, and to trust. If today, a story can be closed with information that is insufficient to be persuasive, then tomorrow, what will happen when similar situations befall ordinary people who have no stage lights and no public attention? From that question, the journey to find the meaning of silence and the responsibility of collective memory begins to unfold. Before the name Menglong appeared densely in public discussions, he was known as a relatively quiet face in the Chinese entertainment industry. His career path did not bear the marks of a loud star or one who frequently faced controversy. On the contrary, the familiar image was that of an actor who worked steadily, spoke little, and rarely took the initiative to step into the center of the media. This very reticence, in an environment accustomed to fierce competition and unnamed implicit rules, became the anchor for the public to start questioning the broader context surrounding the story. The mainland entertainment industry has long been more than just a space for artistic creativity. It is a complex ecosystem where power, economic interests, and public image are tightly intertwined. Within that system, success is not measured only by roles or recognition, but by the ability to adapt to invisible boundaries. There are rules that are not written, but exist as obvious truths. There are boundaries that are not announced, but deeply govern personal choices. For those operating within, silence is sometimes viewed as a safety strategy, a way to maintain balance in a high-pressure environment. According to information recounted later, Menglong once entered a career phase marked by many changes. The surface of these changes could be interpreted in the industry's familiar language: roles, contracts, image orientation. However, behind these seemingly purely professional decisions was a context where the boundary between personal freedom and systemic compliance was not always clear. At this intersection, questions about motives began to form in the public's mind. Public motives are often presented using easily acceptable concepts: career development, contractual responsibility, market demands. These motives are not unusual. They reflect the familiar operational logic of a large-scale entertainment industry. However, alongside them, there always exist hidden motives that are harder to define. Prolonged psychological pressure, the fear of isolation, the feeling of losing control over one's own life, all are factors that are not easily measured but possess a profound influence on personal experience. When the incident occurred, the initial information was published quickly, closing the story with a brief conclusion. Procedurally, this is not uncommon. Yet for many followers, that method of presentation revealed notable gaps. Fundamental questions about the circumstances, the progression, and the chain of related evidence were not clarified in detail. This absence does not automatically equate to wrongdoing, but in a society accustomed to strict information control, it quickly became a catalyst for suspicion. Precisely here, the concept of information gaps began to be mentioned. Information gaps are not just a technical problem of communication, but also a psychological issue for society. When data is insufficient to piece together a complete picture, the public tends to turn back time, searching for details once considered unremarkable. Old statements, old images, even past silences, all are placed into a new context where each disconnected fragment is expected to fill a portion of the unfinished story. This process does not only reflect the desire to find the truth about an individual, it shows that the collective psychology is trying to protect itself from a sense of unease. When an incident involving a celebrity can be closed with unconvincing information, a deeper worry begins to take shape. If tomorrow a similar situation occurs with ordinary people, without stage lights and without public attention, to what extent will they be protected? At a deeper level, the story touches upon a core issue of modern society: who controls information and to what extent? In a system where power and data are not distributed equally, transparency is not just an ethical value, but a condition for maintaining public trust. When that trust is eroded over time, every information gap can become a breeding ground for speculation, even if that speculation is not necessarily based on verified evidence. It is noteworthy that the public's skepticism during this phase does not necessarily stem from a desire to deny all announced information. Instead, it reflects a state of mental self-defense. Asking questions becomes a natural reflex when people feel they do not have full access to the truth. In those circumstances, silence is no longer perceived as neutral. It carries the additional meaning of delay or even evasion. When the information gaps were not yet filled, the story quickly departed from the scope of a personal event and became the center of a media flood. Within a short period, the digital space moved with an intense speed. Platforms usually familiar with entertainment discussions were suddenly flooded with serious questions, reflecting a significant shift in public psychology. Every new piece of information, no matter how small, had the capacity to stir collective emotions and trigger a series of different interpretations. The initial public reaction bore the heavy mark of sharing and mourning. People recalled the remaining images, the roles that left an impact, and a sense of loss that was difficult to name. However, that flow of emotion did not exist independently. Very quickly thereafter, it blended with suspicion. When official announcements were published without enough detail to answer basic questions, the public began to organize its own process of seeking answers. Social media, from merely reflecting events, became a space for restructuring the narrative. In that context, symbolic actions appeared in increasing numbers. Online memorial campaigns, calls for signatures, and the placement of images and messages related to the case in public spaces overseas demonstrated a level of spread that transcended national borders. Notably, this concern did not come only from those who follow the entertainment industry. It attracted communities that were previously less directly involved, but were sensitive to issues of justice, transparency, and the right to know. The story, therefore, touched upon more universal concerns of modern society. Parallel to that spread was an increasingly clear process of polarization in public opinion. One segment of the public chose to trust the announced information. For them, continuing to dig deeper might only increase unnecessary tension and speculation. This view stems from a desire to maintain social order, where official conclusions are seen as necessary stopping points, even if not every detail is made public. Conversely, another group argued that it was the very absence of full information that caused suspicion to spread. For them, asking questions does not equate to denial, but is the minimum requirement to protect public trust. These two streams of perspective existed in parallel and sometimes confronted each other directly in prolonged debates. These exchanges did not only revolve around an individual, but expanded into how society reacts to authoritative announcements. Social media, in this context, served both as a tool for connection and as a space for amplifying conflict. Every article, every video, every comment could be interpreted in many different ways, depending on the experience and position of the recipient. Another factor contributing to the intensity of the media flood was the participation of influential individuals. When voices not directly related to the incident spoke up, the story was placed in a broader frame of reference. Some approached the issue from the perspective of social ethics, emphasizing accountability and the necessity of transparency. Others analyzed it as a classic example of a communication crisis in an environment of information control. Although the approaches differed, the commonality was that this event became a catalyst for a discussion that went far beyond the scope of entertainment. The impact of the media flood did not stop at public opinion. It also influenced how the public perceived the entire cultural and entertainment ecosystem. Questions about power, the safety of individuals within the system, and the boundary between private life and collective interest were repeated with increasing frequency. This concern reflects a societal state where trust is no longer a given but needs to be reinforced by clear and consistent information. Amidst that divided context, emotion powerfully governed how people received information. There were moments when indignation overwhelmed reason, allowing unverified hypotheses to spread rapidly. Simultaneously, efforts appeared calling for restraint, emphasizing the importance of distinguishing between facts and speculation. This tug-of-war created a tense atmosphere where each side believed they were protecting a core value, even though that value was understood in different ways. It was during this phase that the story posed a question not easy to answer. When information is incomplete, to whom does the responsibility of seeking the truth belong, and what are the limits of skepticism? This was no longer an issue unique to one incident, but a collective challenge for society in the digital media era, where the speed of spread often exceeds the capacity for verification. As the wave of discussion expanded and viewpoints gradually revealed themselves clearly, the story entered its darkest phase. This was no longer a time for spontaneous reactions or isolated debates. The absence of information, prolonged day after day, began to leave a deeper mark on the collective perception of society. Unanswered questions accumulated over time, creating a smoldering state of tension where trust became fragile and vulnerable. At this stage, public opinion no longer focused on specific details, but directed attention to the overall picture. Signs once considered scattered were placed together, not to affirm a certain script, but to point out the information gaps that still persisted. These information gaps, though they could not be filled with verified facts, carried significant psychological weight. They caused the public not only to wonder what had happened, but also to worry about how similar incidents might be handled in the future. A sense of helplessness appeared increasingly clearly in exchanges. There were those who admitted that they no longer expected new information soon, yet still could not accept silence as a final conclusion. In that context, skepticism no longer bore a confrontational nuance. It gradually became a mental self-defense mechanism. When unable to access the full truth, people sought to protect themselves by asking questions, even understanding that those questions might never be fully answered. The climax of this dark phase lay in the story transcending the scope of an individual to become a mirror reflecting a common concern. Many began to compare this case with other events from the past, where official announcements were issued quickly but lacked a detailed explanatory process. The repetition of that pattern, even in different contexts, caused the sense of unease to gradually become a familiar state. When the abnormal repeats enough times, society faces the risk of accepting it as an inevitable part of life. However, precisely at that dark point, a subtle transformation began to take shape. Instead of only revolving around suspicions regarding a specific person, the discussion gradually shifted toward the question of collective responsibility. If a story that has not been clarified can cause such a widespread and prolonged effect, what does that say about the relationship between citizens, the media, and power? This question did not aim to find an object for blame, but to clarify the role of each component in maintaining social trust. The moment regarded as an epiphany did not come from a new piece of information or a decisive piece of evidence. It came from the realization that, regardless of the outcome of the case, its impact has gone far beyond its original scope. The central character of the story was no longer mentioned only as an actor or a name associated with controversy. He became a symbol for the concern over the fragility of the individual before larger structures, where an individual voice can easily be drowned out without public attention. From this perspective, many began to look back at their own roles. Not everyone has the capacity to create enough pressure to promote transparency or change the way the system operates. However, the choice not to turn away, not to hastily forget, has been seen as a form of silent participation. In a society where information can be limited, collective memory becomes a different form of archive, harder to control and also harder to erase. This epiphany carried an important realization. This story does not only talk about the past, it poses a question for the future. If today an incident can leave behind so many gaps, what will guarantee that similar stories in the coming years will be handled differently? That question has no simple answer, but the very fact that it was posed showed a change in how society perceives the right to know and the right to ask. At the end of this stage, the dominant emotion was no longer indignation or bewilderment, but sobriety mixed with caution. The public seemed to realize that the search for truth is a long process, requiring patience and the ability to distinguish clearly between desires and facts. Instead of chasing every new hypothesis, many began to emphasize the importance of keeping the discussion from sliding into extremism, so that the very need for transparency is not lost in the wave of emotion. When the darkness of contracts, invisible pressures, and prolonged silence enveloped the name Menglong, what remained was not a final verdict, but a persistent resonance in the minds of those left behind. That resonance is not loud, it does not bear the form of slogans or accusations. It exists as a suspended question, a reminder that there are stories that, even if closed formally, cannot truly end in social consciousness. This case, ultimately, is not just the story of an individual or a profession. It reflects a broader reality of how modern society faces power, information, and trust. When transparency is replaced by ambiguous voids, public trust does not disappear immediately. It is eroded bit by bit through a sense of unease, through unanswered questions, and through becoming accustomed to accepting unclarified things as a normal part of life. Notably, throughout that journey, the need to ask questions did not necessarily imply antagonism. For many, it was simply a way to protect their own capacity for judgment. The refusal to hastily forget a story that has not been clarified was seen as an act of caution rather than a political or moral statement. In that context, collective memory became a special storage space where what has not been fully explained is still held, awaiting more suitable conditions to be perceived. The story of Menglong, therefore, does not provide a clear answer regarding right or wrong. Instead, it poses a cautionary lesson. If today an event can leave behind too many gaps and still pass through time, what will guarantee that similar cases do not repeat tomorrow? This question does not aim to sow doubt, but to emphasize the importance of transparency as the foundation of social trust. At this closing point, the dominant emotion is no longer indignation or mere mourning. It is a quiet awakening. The awakening that observing, remembering, and questioning soberly is the small but necessary part of each individual's responsibility. In a world where information can be limited or shaped, the refusal to forget becomes a choice with long-term meaning. The future remains open, and perhaps the final pieces of this story will never be fully filled. However, its impact has transcended the scope of a personal incident. It forced society to look directly into the most sensitive shadows of the relationship between power and truth. And it is there that the story ends, not with a period, but with a question mark dedicated to all. Will we choose silence for temporary peace, or continue to keep that memory and those questions from being washed away by time?